Hi there! This video will focus on the introduction and overview of the book of Isaiah, since we've been talking about Isaiah 61 in line with Jubilee year or the year of the Lord's favor. Now, before we're going to go through that portion, let's have a review that the Old Testament is divided into four categories. The first category is the first five books of the Pentateuch, namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The next 12 books, from Joshua to Esther, continue the history of the Israelites. They moved into the land of Canaan and established a kingdom that lasted almost 500 years. This is the second category of books under the Old Testament, and we call them the history books. The third category is the books of poetry, where the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs or Songs of Solomon fall under. This third category is also known as the wisdom books. During the years when kings ruled Israel and Judah, God spoke through prophets. Thus, some prophets did predict future events. Their primary role was to call God's people back to Him. The first book in the books of prophets is the book of Isaiah, and the last book is the book of Malachi. In between are Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. For the first book, Isaiah, here it is. The most eloquent of the prophets, Isaiah, analyzed the failures of all the nations around him and pointed to a future Messiah who would bring peace. On the other hand, the last Old Testament prophet, Malachi, faced a nation that had grown indifferent. He sought to steer them from apathy. The introduction to the book of Isaiah. Prophet, poet, and politician. His nation at a crossroads. Isaiah rose to meet the challenge. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. For righteousness, but heard cries of distress, according to Isaiah 5, verse 7. The prophet Isaiah was a giant of Jewish history. The New Testament quotes him more than all the other prophets combined. No other biblical author can match his rich vocabulary and use of imagery. Isaiah spent his days in the corridors of power. He served as advisor to the kings of Judah and helped set the course of his nation. Days of crisis. Isaiah lived at a crucial time, midway between the founding of the kingdom under Saul and David and its eventual destruction. A civil war had split the Israelites into North Israel and South Judah, and Isaiah lived in the more pious southern kingdom. When Isaiah began his work, the nation seemed strong and wealthy. But Isaiah saw signs of grave danger. People were using their power to harass the poor. Men went around drunk, and women cared more about their clothes than about their neighbor's hunger. People gave lip service to God and kept up the outward appearance of religion but did little more. Outside, dangers loomed even larger. The armies of neighboring Israel were rattling swords and spears at the border. On all sides, monster empires were growing, especially Egypt and Assyria. Judah was caught in the middle. Should the nation choose one of the empires as an ally or an ally? Harsh words from an uncompromising prophet. The nation of Judah, said Isaiah, stood at a crossroads. It could either regain its footing or begin a dangerous slide downward. The prophet did not temper his message for the sake of popular opinion. He had harsh and unyielding words about what changes must take place. Although he moved in royal circles, Isaiah was hardly a yes man in politics. Sometimes he stood alone against a tide of optimism. His very name meant, "The Lord saves," and he warned kings that relying on military power or wealth or any force other than God would lead to disaster. Isaiah outlasted four kings, but he finally offended one beyond repair. King Manasseh, notorious for practicing infant sacrifice, found Isaiah's strong words too much to bear. Tradition records that he had Isaiah killed by fastening him between two planks of wood and sawing his body in half. Manasseh has long since disappeared into obscurity, but Isaiah, through his book, endures as one of the great authors of all time. Sometimes the pen is mightier than the sword. Now, just in case you don't want to limit yourselves with Isaiah 61 or the year of the Lord's favor, and instead you want to go ahead and do your reading and meditation or intent reading for the whole book of Isaiah, allow me to proceed to how to read the book of Isaiah. Let me start with this. In the 8th century BC, Isaiah wrote the book that bears his name. It is arguably the most eloquent book in the Old Testament, and you will likely recognize many verses and phrases. Isaiah is full of profound insights into the nature of God and his plan for the earth. Due to its length and its peculiar organization, however, the book may seem hard to grasp. Remember that Isaiah consists of a collection of many messages on various topics, pulled together into groupings. To understand Isaiah, it helps us to think of the book as divided into several major groupings. Here is a summary of them. Isaiah chapters 1 to 12 talk about Isaiah's called messages of warning to Judah during the prosperous days of the kingdom. In parentheses, this came mostly in the reigns of Uzziah and Jotham. Now we're going to discuss about the lineup of rulers one of these days. Isaiah chapters 13 to 23, alright, the second grouping. Isaiah's messages to all nations around Judah, including enemies and close allies or allies. For the third grouping, Isaiah 24 to 35, a view of the earth's future, specifically on chapters 24 to 27, followed by the specific message or messages to the people of Judah as they faced Assyria's imminent invasion. The next grouping, Isaiah chapters 36 to 39, an interlude telling of great crisis faced by King Hezekiah. The focus of the book moves from Assyria to Babylon. Next, Isaiah chapters 40 to 48. Prophecies addressed the very different situation, 200 years into the future. Now Babylon, not Assyria, is a great enemy. Now for the next grouping, Isaiah chapters 49 to 55. A word of hope about the final deliverance through the suffering servant. And then lastly, Isaiah chapters 56 to 66. This talk about general warnings to Judah and a view of the future. As usual, we have plans 1 and 2 in our reading and meditation. Alright? But for the book of Isaiah, you can just do the overview in 6 days. Alright? In 1 week or less. So for day 1, just like what we've done, read the introduction to Isaiah, and then proceed to chapter 6. This chapter describes Isaiah's dramatic call. Now for the second day, in your plan 1, or the overview, proceed to chapter 25, which focuses on a song of praise. Day 3, for the overview, proceed to chapter 40, a great description of God and His power over the whole earth. And then day 4, chapter 52, which gives a detailed description of God's ultimate plan. And then for day 5, read chapter 53, a remarkable prophecy quoted at least 10 times in the New Testament. For day 6, read chapter 55, a word of great comfort from God. And for plan 2, all of Isaiah in 60 to 63 days. So from chapter 1 to chapter 66. Again, for the overview of Isaiah in 6 days under Plan 1, Day 1, Introduction to Isaiah that proceed to chapter 6. Day 2, chapter 25. Day 3, chapter 40. Day 4, chapter 52. Day 5, chapter 53. And Day 6, chapter 55. So for Plan 2, just have the freedom to do the whole of Isaiah in 60 to 63 days from chapter 1 to chapter 66 in order. Okay? That's all for now. God bless us all. Introduction to the Book of Malachi. When faith grows weary, Malachi spoke to people going through the motions. A son honors his father, and a servant his master. If I am a father, where is the honor due me? According to chapter 1, verse 6. Success has dangers of its own. When you reach the top, you may tend to slack off. Spiritual life can gradually deteriorate too. Malachi, in his short book, tried to awaken Israel from slackness in relating to God. Years before, they had optimistically returned to Jerusalem after a long exile. Their faith had grown deeper through difficulties. Despite fierce opposition, they had rebuilt the temple, the symbol of their hope in God. They had expected God to supernaturally fill it with His glory and make their nation the center of the world. By Malachi's time, Israel's hope had faded. In fact, life seemed to have passed the Israelites by. They could not see that God loved them, according to Malachi 1, verse 2. And they felt that serving God brought no reward, according to chapter 2, verse 17, and chapter 3, verse 14. No big sinners. The people of Jerusalem had become lukewarm. Their complaints showed it, and so did their actions. They were not big sinners, big quote unquote, like the people before the exile, who had practiced child sacrifice and brought idols into the temple. Malachi's people had kept their religion, but they had lost contact with the God whom the religion was all about. While Malachi mentioned the same injustices and evils earlier prophets has blasted, according to 3 verse 5, he concentrated most of his energy on problems that may seem petty in comparison. Mixed marriages, divorce, and apathetic worship, shown in their second-rate offerings. Through Malachi's eyes, we see the Israelites going through the motions of their faith, doing the bare minimum. How do you heat up a lukewarm faith? Malachi used several tactics. He began with God's love. To his audience, it was not apparent, but if they would compare their situation with neighboring Edoms, they would see that God had been caring for them all along. Curing a careless attitude. Malachi then challenged the Jews to take obedience seriously. They were bringing injured or sick animals to God for offerings. Try offering them to your governor, Malachi said. Would he be pleased with you? As stated in 1 verse 8. Malachi urged them to bring the perfect animals God's law demands and his honor requires. Malachi further demanded that they stop marrying women of other religions, a practice that inevitably introduced religious compromise. They must also put an end to divorce. And finally, they must bring a full tenth, the tithe of their income to God at the temple. Their skimping amounted to robbery from God. Malachi didn't demand these changes just because they were in the rule book. They were actions meant to symbolize an inner attitude. The people must practice their faith seriously. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. According to Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. The last voice. Malachi's was the last Old Testament voice. It reverberated through 400 or more years of biblical silence. During those years, at least some of Malachi's message took hold. Led by the Pharisees, Jews became increasingly devoted to keeping the Old Testament law. Unfortunately, many of them lost Malachi's main point. They forgot that the law was not an end in itself. It was a means by which to give God the honor he deserves. Now, for those who want to do reading and meditation here in the book of Malachi, so let me share this to you and with you. How to read Malachi. Okay, to start, God's voice dominates Malachi, the voice of a loving father pleading with his children. The people's response is given in the form of 7 questions or complaints. The result is a kind of dialogue, almost an argument, which lets us see into the personal attitudes of God and the people he is speaking to. As in most arguments, a variety of issues are raised, but they are all rooted in a few basic attitudes. As you read through Malachi, try to see what attitudes lay behind the questions, complaints, and problems of God's people. Also note what attitudes lay behind God's words and promises to them. You can place Malachi's message in the context of Israelite history by looking up, or when we do, the lineup of rulers. Okay? Now, for Plan 1 and Plan 2, of course for Plan 1, the overview of Malachi in one day. So, day 1, just one day, read the introduction to Malachi and chapter 3, which actually lays out some of God's promises and expectations for His people. Now, for Plan 2, just read the whole book of Malachi in 3 days. So, chapter 1, chapter 2, and then in same day, chapters 3 and 4. Okay, so that's all for now. Be blessed with the Word of God. Till next time.